Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives, the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. We are continuing our series on the meaning of creation, looking at Genesis 1 through 11, and trying to figure out where does humanity belong based on these passages. This is the 9th lesson in a 10-lesson series, so we're coming close to the end, and this one describes and kind of the idea of what if we started over, which is the idea behind the flood. So we're going to start by looking at Genesis 6, 1 through 8, and this is a notoriously difficult passage to interpret. And we're going to try to build some skills as we interpret this passage. So let's look at the text and just kind of think through some of the things going on here. So Genesis 6, verse 1, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So there's quite a lot going on in that passage, and we won't cover everything. Some of those things will be left for kind of a conversation, but we're going to look at basically who are we talking about. And this is where a lot of the issues with the passage comes in. Several phrases are used in this passage to describe specific groups that are rather obscure. The sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, the heroes of old who are men of renown. All four of those groups are kind of up for debate of who they are actually talking about. There's a lot of theories, a lot of discussion, a lot of stuff that's going on in those passages, in those categories that we're kind of unsure of. And there have been major debates and several times rather contentious sort of assumptions based on who those are. Now, one of the things that I'm going to kind of assume as we interpret this is, and it's based on this idea of the timeline. So Adam plus or minus 4,000 years BC. We'll figure that out. There's a lot of debate about that. We can talk about that later, but let's just assume that. That would put the flood at 2400 BC, someplace around there, about 1600 years after Adam and about 2400 years before Jesus. That would put Abraham about 2000 BC, and then Moses, who is the author and Moses' audience, at 1400 BC. So there's 1,000 years between the flood and the author audience of Genesis. That would be similar to like the Battle of Hastings, which is in 1066, or the First Crusade, which is in 1096 for us. So the people who are reading it, are reading or hearing this discussed, are hearing about something that is ancient history to them. The flood and the people before the flood are not people that they are familiar with. So it would be wrong to assume that the original audience has information on this event at all. They might have some myth and story, but really they're as unknown about what's going on as the next person. So how to interpret who we are talking about should come from and be embedded in the text. So this passage, we have problems interpreting it, 3,500 years after it was written. We're struggling to figure it out. But the original audience would also not know who these terms were referring to unless it's somehow in the text. They are 1,000 years removed from the actual story, so they don't have any inside information. They can't. The author cannot assume they'll know who he is talking about. So he had to actually somehow. So the text should be important in trying to figure out who he is talking about. Using that idea, let's look at some of the possible hints that the text actually gives us and who these people are. So began to increase in number on the earth, God echoes God's commands from 128. So humanity is increasing. So there's a call back to Genesis 1. And daughters were born to them. Echoes the refrain from chapter 5 about sons and daughters, but also could allude to Adah and Zillah in 419 and Naaman in 422 of Lamech, the descendants of Cain. These are the only named women in Genesis 1 through 11 besides Eve. So the fact that it mentions daughters might be a callback to the named women just before this passage, just a chapter, 2 chapters before this passage. Sons of God reminds us of humanity is created in the image of God, 5:1 and 5:3. It is possible to interpret this phrase simply as godly sons. So it's not. It might just be the author saying the godly people, they had godly sons, or sons of God, but also this kind of image of God is language there as well. So the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and married whoever they chose. Saw that it was good, took and ate is what happens with Eve with the fruit in the garden. So there may be a callback there that this idea is seeing it as good, and then taking is kind of what happened in Genesis 3 with that first scene. So there's some very similar language there. Genesis 4 and 5 that we talked about in the previous lesson contrasts the descendants of Cain and Seth, describing a godly line of humanity, Seth's line, and an ungodly line of humanity, Cain's line. And we've just spent 2 chapters, 4 and 5, examining that there was godly descendants of Adam and ungodly descendants of Adam. And the godly descendants of Adam were created in the image of God. Well, were born in the image of God. It specifically says Adam was created in the image of God, likeness and image, and then Seth had the likeness and image of Adam. Genesis 6 could be building on this contrast, using the term sons of God to describe the godly line and daughters of men to describe the ungodly line. But the point it's making, if that is true, the separation between the ungodly and the godly was overcome or was removed by the godly sons marrying the ungodly daughters. So what I would say here and how I would interpret this, just based on the text alone, no outside assumptions, because I think the text is what we have to work with here. I would say that the sons of God are the godly descendants of Seth. And then the daughters of men are the ungodly female descendants of Cain. And the point of chapter 4 and 5 was to show that humanity is divided between these godly and ungodly lines, that there are 2 sides to humanity here. But then the point of 6 in these verses in 6 shows that through marriage, these 2 sides are actually just becoming one side. And all of humanity, the godly line of Seth and the ungodly line of Cain, are being corrupted because they're intermarrying and just becoming one group of humanity. and a sinful, wicked group of humanity. That's kind of how I'm reading the text and trying to take connections from what we've previously seen to interpret these passages. There are arguments against those things, but I kind of like, for me, the biggest argument for it is it assumes that the original audience would be able to understand who these people are without prior knowledge of the events, just based on the text. For me, it assumes that the author of Genesis built in the understanding of who these individuals were. Then we have the Nephilim. This is even more interesting. I don't know. I'm not so sure I have come to a conclusion on who the Nephilim are. It is only used here and in Numbers 13:33. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Numbers 13:33 seems to indicate that the Nephilim in Canaan were giants. Many use that to interpret Genesis 6:4 to mean giants as well, but the destruction of the flood means that they were not the same giants. Also, there is nothing in 6:4 to indicate they were giants, just great men, even if you connect them to the end of the verse. Based on etymology of the word, it could mean the fallen ones. The syntax of the sentence might mean that the Nephilim are the same as the heroes of old, men of renown, but that's not for certain. It could simply mean that the Nephilim were contemporaries to the heroes of old. So there's a lot of unknown here. This word is only used twice. The second time, because it's the taking of the land of Canaan, it is definitely, and it's post-flood, and it's very far after the flood, is definitely not connected to, like, they're not the same people. Now, it seems like the Israelites taking Canaan uses this word based on and based off of what's coming up in this Genesis 6 passage. So they're saying these people are like those people back in Genesis 6. So Numbers seems to be referring to Genesis 6. But they can't be the same people because the flood would have wiped out anyone referred to as Nephilim here pre-flood. Now, and we don't even know, the grammar is unspecific between whether or not these Nephilim who were around at that time are the same people that are being referred to as the heroes of old and the men of renown. I like that idea because it just makes more sense in the verse. So these Nephilim are just great men of renown. That, the mixing of the two lines, the sons of God and the daughters of men marrying, created these heroes, these great men, these men of renown, and great men are called Nephilim. That's the simplest interpretation of this, not reading too much into it. They weren't giants. They were giants in, more of the social, giants of industry or something like that, not like actually overly big people, but just heroes. But that's not for certain in what the text says. Now, but this is one thing we can get out of the text. No matter who the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, the heroes of old, and the men of renown are, the message of Genesis 6:1-8 remains the same. Humanity was fulfilling Genesis 1:28 by being fruitful and filling the earth. But as they were filling the earth with human beings, those human beings were filling the earth with wickedness. God decides to remove the wickedness from the earth. In order to do this, he needed to remove humanity. So that's basically what's going on in this passage. Whoever these people are, it's bad. They're doing evil, they're wicked, and God is going to remove humanity because of the wickedness. But But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And this is kind of where we end. Maybe if God reestablishes a new humanity solely built from the righteous Noah, then humanity can be righteous. This is the expectation of the author. The author of Genesis wants us to have as we enter the story of the flood. So we're building this up. Okay, humanity is terrible. It needs to be destroyed. It's bringing wickedness and violence. But Noah finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. Maybe if we restart from Noah, we'll get something better this time. That's the expectation going into this story. So some questions for discussion. How do you feel when a passage of Scripture is difficult to interpret? Let me know. Drop down in the comments and say something. The text says that God regretted and his heart was deeply troubled. Can God have regrets? What does it mean for God to have regrets? Would love to have a conversation with you around those ideas as well. As always, there are 3 ways to join: in person Sunday nights 5 p.m. and then live Monday nights 7 p.m. via Zoom. These weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow as appropriate. Enjoyed having this conversation with you. Hopefully it continues real soon.